5 million American women. That's not how many joined the feminist movement in the past decade. That's how many explicitly rejected it, embracing a lifestyle that feminism spent 50 years trying to eliminate. They're called tradwives, traditional wives. Women in their 20s and 30s choosing to be stay-at-home mothers, submitting to their husband's leadership, rejecting careers for homemaking, and building their identities around motherhood and domesticity. They're baking bread from scratch, homeschooling their children, wearing dresses, and posting about it on social media to millions of followers. And they're overwhelmingly Christian. This isn't a fringe movement. This is millions of educated, capable women making choices that the culture insists are oppressive, regressive, and impossible. Women with college degrees choosing to stay home. Women who could have careers choosing to have babies instead. Women rejecting the feminist promise that liberation meant looking like men and finding something feminism couldn't provide. The Tradwife movement is growing faster than anyone predicted. It's reshaping American Christianity, challenging feminist orthodoxy, and revealing that the promises of second-wave feminism failed an entire generation of women. And the backlash from both secular culture and progressive Christianity has been fierce. This is the story of why millions of women are choosing tradition over feminism, submission over independence, and motherhood over careerism. What's driving them, what they're finding, and what their choice reveals about the crisis facing modern women and modern feminism. Let's start with numbers that make both feminists and egalitarian Christians deeply uncomfortable. Surveys conducted between 2020 and 2024 show a dramatic shift in young women's attitudes toward traditional gender roles. A 2023 Pew Research study found that among women aged 18 to 34, 38% now believe that children are better off when a parent stays home full-time, up from 28% in 2018. That's a 10-point swing in 5 years among the demographic feminism assumed it had won. Among Christian women in the same age group, the numbers are even more striking. 56% of evangelical women under 35 believe that wives should submit to their husband's leadership, a number that has increased every year since 2019. 47% say their ideal life includes being a stay-at-home mother, up from 32% in 2017. The social media presence of Tradwife content is massive. Instagram accounts promoting traditional Christian womanhood have exploded. Accounts like The Transformed Wife, Girl Defined, and dozens of smaller Tradwife influencers collectively reach over 15 million followers. YouTube channels teaching homemaking, submission, and biblical womanhood generate tens of millions of views monthly. TikTok Tradwife content has gone viral repeatedly, with videos showing young women baking bread, canning vegetables, caring for children, and explaining why they chose traditional roles over careers reaching hundreds of millions of views. The hashtag #NowToTradwife has over 500 million views. Hashtag Biblical Womanhood has over 300 million. Book sales tell the same story. Fascinating Womanhood by Helen Andelin, a 1963 book on traditional marriage that was out of print for decades, has been republished and is selling thousands of copies monthly to millennial and Gen Z women. The Excellent Wife by Martha Peace remains a Christian bestseller. New books promoting biblical femininity and traditional gender roles are published monthly and immediately find eager audiences. The homeschooling boom provides more evidence. Between 2020 and 2024, the number of homeschooling families in America increased by 43%, from 2.5 million to 3.7 million students. The vast majority of homeschooling parents are mothers who left careers or chose never to enter the workforce to educate their children at home. Approximately 72% of homeschooling families identify as Christian and embrace traditional gender roles. Churches are noticing the shift. Conservative denominations that teach complementarian theology, the belief that men and women have different but complementary roles in marriage and church, are seeing growth among young families. Churches that offer women's ministries focused on homemaking, biblical femininity, and motherhood report surging attendance. The demographic collapse in progressive churches is matched by demographic growth in conservative ones, and the difference is young women choosing tradition. The economic data supports this. Labor force participation among women aged 25 to 34 with children under 5 has declined from 71% in 2019 to 64% in 2024. That's a 7-point drop in 5 years, representing approximately 1.2 million women who either left the workforce or never entered it to stay home with young children. This isn't poverty forcing women out of jobs. The decline is most pronounced among college-educated women from middle and upper-middle-class households, exactly the demographic feminism assumed would be most committed to careers. These are women with options choosing domesticity. The Tradwife movement represents an estimated 5 million American women who have explicitly rejected feminist ideology and embraced traditional Christian gender roles as their identity and calling. They're not doing this quietly or apologetically. They're vocal, visible, and increasingly influential. And they're not who anyone expected. Understanding the Tradwife movement requires understanding who these women are and what led them to reject feminism. The profile is remarkably consistent. Tradwives are disproportionately millennials and Gen Z, women in their 20s and early 30s. They're educated, with 68% holding bachelor's degrees or higher. They're middle class or upper middle class from families with resources and opportunities. They're white at higher rates than the general population, though the movement is diversifying. Most grew up in Christian homes, though not necessarily conservative ones. Many were raised in moderate evangelical or mainline Protestant families, where feminism and egalitarianism were assumed rather than questioned. They went to college, pursued degrees, and prepared for careers, exactly what their parents, churches, and culture told them to do. Then something shifted. Hannah, a 28-year-old former marketing professional, now stay-at-home mother of 3 in Tennessee, describes her journey. "I did everything right, according to feminism. Got my degree, landed a good job, was independent and career-focused, but I was miserable. I was exhausted trying to be excellent at work while feeling guilty about not being home. The feminist promise was that I could have it all, but having it all meant being mediocre at everything and fulfilled by nothing." Hannah quit her job when her second child was born and hasn't looked back. "The moment I embraced being just a wife and mother, I felt free. All the pressure to prove myself through career success vanished. I could pour myself into my family without apologizing for it. And I realized feminism had lied to me. It told me homemaking was oppression when it's actually the most fulfilling thing I've ever done." This story repeats constantly. Women who pursued careers, achieved success, and discovered that professional achievement didn't provide the meaning, purpose, or satisfaction they'd been promised. Who found that having it all meant being stressed, divided, and constantly guilty about neglecting either work or family. Others are women who never entered the workforce. Sarah, a 25-year-old newlywed in Texas, describes her choice. "I graduated college with a business degree and immediately got married. Everyone expected me to start a career, but my husband and I talked about it and decided I'd stay home. We're trying to have kids soon, and I want to be fully present for them. My education isn't wasted. I use it managing our household, teaching future children, and supporting my husband. I just use it differently than feminism says I should." Sarah faced intense criticism from family and friends. "My own mother was disappointed. She'd fought for women's rights and couldn't understand why I'd throw away my education and opportunities. Friends called me oppressed and said I was setting women back. But I'm happier than they are. They're climbing corporate ladders and complaining about work-life balance. I'm building a family and actually enjoying life." What unites these diverse women is a shared rejection of feminism's core claims. They don't believe that career success equals fulfillment. They don't believe that motherhood and homemaking are inferior to paid work. They don't believe that submission to their husbands is oppression. and they don't believe that looking like men is liberation. Instead, they've embraced what they see as biblical design for womanhood, complementary to masculinity, centered on home and family, and finding dignity in roles feminism dismissed as worthless. Many tradwives discovered these ideas through social media, books, or online communities rather than through churches. They found women online living traditional lives and teaching that this was not only acceptable, but desirable. They saw mothers who seemed genuinely happy, marriages that appeared healthy, and families that looked stable, contrasting sharply with the stressed, divided, and broken lives they saw around them. The Tradwife influencers became mentors. Women like Lori Alexander, The Transformed Wife, Girl Defined Sisters, and dozens of smaller accounts taught biblical womanhood, submission, homemaking, and motherhood as high callings. They provided theological frameworks, practical advice, and community for women choosing tradition. The Tradwife movement isn't just about what women are embracing, it's about what they're explicitly rejecting. And understanding those rejections reveals what's driving the movement. Rejecting the feminist promise that career equals fulfillment. Second-wave feminism told women that paid work was inherently more valuable, meaningful, and dignifying than domestic work. That to be fulfilled, women needed careers. That staying home was wasting potential. Tradwives call this a lie. They argue that feminism devalued the most important work, raising children and building families, while elevating corporate work that serves shareholders over households. They point to data showing that career-focused women often report lower life satisfaction than stay-at-home mothers, particularly after having children. One Tradwife blogger writes, "Feminism convinced women that changing diapers was degrading, but answering emails from demanding bosses was empowering. That raising your own children was unfulfilling, but raising someone else's profits was meaningful. The entire framework was backwards. It elevated servitude to corporations while denigrating service to your own family." Third-wave feminism argued that gender differences are primarily social constructs and that men and women should have identical roles in marriage, parenting, and society. Tradwives reject this entirely. They argue that men and women are fundamentally different, biologically, psychologically, and spiritually, and that these differences are good and purposeful. That masculine leadership and feminine support are complementary, not hierarchical. That children benefit from having fathers who lead and mothers who nurture in distinct ways. This rejection extends to how they raise their own children. Tradwife families typically embrace traditional gender socialization, teaching boys to be strong, protective, and leaders while teaching girls to be nurturing, supportive, and domestic. This flies in the face of progressive parenting that tries to eliminate gender distinctions. Progressive Christianity and secular culture both promote egalitarian marriage, where spouses are equals with no hierarchy. Tradwives explicitly reject this model in favor of complementarian marriage, where husbands lead and wives submit. This is the most controversial aspect of Tradwife theology. Critics call it patriarchal oppression. Tradwives call it biblical design. They argue that submission doesn't mean subordination or abuse, but rather willing deference to masculine leadership in a loving marriage relationship. Hannah explains, "Submission isn't my husband ordering me around. It's me trusting his leadership and supporting his decisions, even when I disagree. We discuss everything. He values my input, but ultimately he's responsible before God for our family's direction, and I'm responsible for supporting that direction. That structure has brought peace to our marriage because we're not constantly fighting for control." Rejecting the sexual revolution. Tradwives overwhelmingly reject hookup culture, casual sex, cohabitation before marriage, and the sexual liberation that feminism promoted. They embrace chastity before marriage, sexual exclusivity within marriage, and the idea that sex is designed for procreation and bonding within permanent commitment. This rejection extends to birth control in some cases. While not universal, many tradwives limit or avoid hormonal contraception, embrace natural family planning, and are open to having larger families than cultural norms. They see fertility as blessing rather than burden and children as purpose rather than obstacle to career and lifestyle. Rejecting the independence narrative. Feminism taught women that independence, financial, emotional, and social, was essential for freedom and dignity, that depending on men was dangerous and degrading. Tradwives reject this entirely. They embrace interdependence in marriage. They're financially dependent on their husbands and see that as appropriate rather than risky. They build their social lives around family and church rather than career networks. They reject the idea that autonomy is the highest good. Feminism says, depending on my husband makes me vulnerable, but marriage is supposed to be vulnerable. We're one flesh. His success is my success. His provision allows me to focus on our home. That's not oppression. It's partnership with distinct roles. The Tradwife movement has generated intense backlash from both secular feminists and progressive Christians. Understanding the criticism reveals the cultural and theological fault lines the movement exposes. Secular feminists call tradwives victims of false consciousness. The most common secular critique is that tradwives have been brainwashed by patriarchy, that they think they're choosing freely but are actually victims of religious indoctrination and cultural pressure, that they'll regret their choices when they're trapped in unhappy marriages with no career prospects. Feminist critics point to economic vulnerability. What happens if tradwives' marriages fail? How will they support themselves with resume gaps and no recent work experience? They argue that financial dependence on husbands is inherently risky and that tradwives are one divorce away from poverty. Tradwives respond that this criticism is condescending and dismissive, that feminists can't accept that educated, capable women might genuinely prefer traditional roles. That feminist theory requires portraying tradwives as victims, because acknowledging their agency would undermine feminist claims about what liberation requires. Progressive Christians call tradwives biblically wrong. Egalitarian Christians argue that tradwife theology misinterprets Scripture, that biblical submission texts are culturally conditioned and don't apply to modern marriage, that Galatians 3:28's declaration that there is neither male nor female in Christ abolishes gender hierarchy, that mutual submission, not female submission, is the Christian ideal. They argue that complementarian theology gives theological cover to abuse, that teaching wives to submit creates power imbalances that abusers exploit. That tradwife ideology traps women in harmful situations and teaches them to spiritualize suffering. Tradwives respond that egalitarians are capitulating to culture rather than submitting to Scripture. That clear biblical texts about male leadership and female submission can't be explained away. That abuse is a distortion of biblical headship, not its natural result. And that egalitarian marriages often struggle with power conflicts that complementarian structures resolve. Both sides worry about economic and social vulnerability. Critics across the spectrum worry that tradwives are making themselves economically vulnerable by leaving the workforce, that if marriages fail, they'll have no way to support themselves, that they're dependent on their husband's goodwill and have no recourse if that fails. They also worry about social isolation, that stay-at-home mothers lose adult interaction, professional identity, and connections outside the home, that this isolation can lead to depression, loss of self, and inability to leave unhealthy situations. Tradwives acknowledge these risks but argue they're worth it for the benefits traditional life provides. They point out that divorce rates are actually lower in complementarian marriages than egalitarian ones, that stay-at-home mothers report higher life satisfaction than working mothers in most studies, and that social isolation is a risk in any life structure and can be mitigated through church community and intentional relationships. Underneath all the criticism is a fundamental theological disagreement about what the Bible teaches about gender, marriage, and women's roles. Complementarians and egalitarians read the same scriptures and reach opposite conclusions. This isn't new. Christians have debated these texts for decades, but the Tradwife movement has made the debate visible and urgent again because millions of women are choosing complementarianism and publicly defending it. The stakes are high. If Tradwives are right, then feminism led generations of women away from God's design and into dissatisfaction disguised as liberation. If critics are right, then Tradwives are embracing oppression and teaching dangerous theology that harms women. Despite the criticism, Tradwives report that traditional life provides what feminism couldn't: purpose, fulfillment, stable families, and genuine freedom from the pressures modern women face. Purpose rooted in clear calling. Tradwives describe having clarity about their purpose that career-focused women often lack. Their calling is clear: build and nurture their families. Their priorities are straightforward: husband, children, home. Their success metrics are relational rather than professional. This clarity eliminates the constant questioning modern women face about whether they're successful enough, achieving enough, or balancing enough. Tradwives know what they're supposed to be doing and can pour themselves into it without constant second-guessing. Rachel, a 32-year-old homeschooling mother of 4, explains, "I don't have to wonder if I'm living up to my potential. My potential is right here: raising godly children, supporting my husband, building a home. Every diaper I change, every meal I cook, every lesson I teach is fulfilling my calling. There's peace in that." Multiple studies show that complementarian marriages report higher satisfaction levels than egalitarian marriages, particularly among wives. The reasons aren't entirely clear, but Tradwives offer explanations. They argue that clear role definition eliminates power struggles. That submission paradoxically gives wives influence because husbands value their input, precisely because final decisions rest with husbands. That traditional division of labor allows both spouses to excel in their domains rather than competing in all domains. Emma, married 8 years, says, "We don't fight about who does what or who's in charge because we already know. My husband leads, I support, he provides, I manage the home. There's no resentment because we're both fulfilling our roles willingly. I see my egalitarian friends constantly fighting about chores, decisions, and who's sacrificing more. We don't have those fights." Freedom from the double burden. Working mothers often describe feeling pulled in two directions: never fully present at work or home, always feeling guilty about neglecting one for the other. This double burden of professional and domestic responsibilities is exhausting and often unfulfilling. Tradwives eliminate this by choosing one direction. They're fully present for their families without competing professional obligations. They don't feel guilty about career underachievement because they're not pursuing careers. They don't feel guilty about neglecting children because their children are their primary focus. Jessica, who left a nursing career to stay home, describes the relief. "I spent 3 years trying to be a good nurse and good mother and failing at both. I was exhausted, stressed, and miserable. Quitting work felt like coming up for air. Suddenly, I could just focus on my family without divided loyalties. The freedom was incredible." The Tradwife movement has created robust online and in-person communities where women support each other, share resources, and validate choices that the broader culture criticizes. These communities provide practical help, recipes, homeschooling curricula, parenting advice, household management tips, but they also provide emotional support and theological encouragement. When culture says Tradwives are oppressed, these communities say they're obedient. When families criticize their choices, these communities celebrate them. The community aspect is particularly important for women who face isolation or criticism. Online Tradwife groups, church women's ministries, and homeschool co-ops provide the social connection and affirmation that traditional life requires. Children who are thriving. Tradwives consistently point to their children as evidence that their choice was right. They argue that children raised by present mothers in stable homes with clear gender roles are healthier, happier, and better adjusted than children raised in dual-career, egalitarian households. While data on this is complex and contested, Tradwives report that their children have strong relationships with parents, clear moral foundations, excellent education through homeschooling, and stable family structures that provide security. The Tradwife movement's explosive growth reveals uncomfortable truths about feminism, modern womanhood, and what women actually want versus what culture tells them they should want. The core promise of second-wave feminism was that career opportunities, sexual liberation, and independence would make women happier and more fulfilled than traditional roles ever could. 50 years later, the data doesn't support this. Women's reported happiness has declined relative to men's since the 1970s despite massive gains in educational and career opportunities. Working mothers report higher stress, worse work-life balance, and lower life satisfaction than previous generations. The having it all promise has largely proven false. Most women feel they're failing at everything rather than succeeding at multiple roles. The Tradwife movement represents women who looked at feminism's results and said, no thanks. Who evaluated the lives of career-focused women and decided traditional life looked better. This rejection suggests feminism's promises weren't universally desirable, at least not to the women actually living with the results. Women and men may actually be different. The Tradwife movement's embrace of gender differences contradicts decades of feminist theory, arguing that gender is primarily socially constructed. Tradwives report that embracing feminine roles feels natural, fulfilling, and aligned with how they're designed. This doesn't prove that all women prefer traditional roles, obviously many don't, but it does suggest that feminist theory's insistence that gender differences are purely cultural may be wrong, that many women genuinely prefer complementary rather than identical roles, that feminine and masculine aren't oppressive categories but meaningful distinctions. Despite cultural messages that career success is paramount, millions of women still find their primary meaning, purpose, and identity in relationships, marriage, and motherhood, rather than professional achievement. This isn't false consciousness. It's not internalized oppression. It's women making informed choices about what brings them fulfillment. And for millions, that's family, not career. The Tradwife movement reveals that feminism's devaluation of domestic life backfired. By insisting that homemaking was inferior to paid work, feminism made women who preferred traditional roles feel ashamed and defensive. The Tradwife movement rejects that shame and reclaims domestic life as valuable and dignifying. There's a crisis in modern womanhood. The explosion of Tradwife content, the millions of followers, the rapid growth, all of this reveals that huge numbers of women are dissatisfied with what modern womanhood offers. They're searching for alternatives. They're hungry for models of femininity that aren't just be like men. The Tradwife movement filled that hunger. It offered a comprehensive vision of womanhood rooted in biblical theology, validated by community, and demonstrated by visible examples. And millions of women found it more compelling than feminism's vision. This suggests a crisis in how culture defines womanhood. If this many women are rejecting mainstream feminism for traditional Christianity, then mainstream feminism isn't meeting their needs, answering their questions, or providing the purpose and fulfillment they're seeking. The rise of Tradwife Christianity isn't a return to the 1950s. It's a response to feminism's failures and a rejection of its core claims by women who evaluated the promises and found them wanting. 5 million women choosing traditional roles isn't a fringe movement or temporary trend. It's a significant shift revealing that feminism's vision of liberation, looking like men, prioritizing careers, embracing independence, doesn't actually liberate the women who try to live it. Tradwives aren't ignorant or brainwashed. They're educated women making informed choices based on what they've seen feminism produce versus what traditional Christianity offers. They've looked at career-focused women who are stressed, divided, and unfulfilled, and they've chosen a different path. Their choice challenges everything modern culture assumes about gender, marriage, and what women need to flourish. It suggests that complementarity might be more fulfilling than equality. That submission might provide freedom from burdens feminism created. That motherhood might offer purpose that careers can't match. The backlash against tradwives reveals how threatening this choice is to feminist ideology. If women can freely choose traditional roles and be genuinely happy, then feminism's claim that those roles are inherently oppressive falls apart. The existence of fulfilled tradwives undermines the entire feminist project. But the backlash also reveals genuine concerns. Economic vulnerability is real. Divorce happens. Abuse exists. Tradwife theology can be twisted to justify terrible things. The critics aren't entirely wrong to worry about these risks. The question is whether those risks outweigh the benefits Tradwives report finding. Purpose, fulfillment, stable marriages, present motherhood, and freedom from the double burden of trying to excel professionally and domestically simultaneously. Tradwives have decided the benefits are worth the risks. 5 million women and counting have made that same calculation, and their numbers are growing as more women look at feminism's results and decide they want something different. This movement will continue reshaping American Christianity and challenging feminist orthodoxy. It will force conversations about what Scripture actually teaches, what women actually want, and whether feminism's promises were true. If this investigation matters to you, if you want to understand the cultural and theological battles reshaping American Christianity, subscribe to Christian Faith Archive. We investigate the movements, ideologies, and choices that reveal where Christianity is heading and what believers actually believe versus what institutions claim they believe, because the Tradwife movement isn't just about homemaking and submission. It's about whether feminism succeeded or failed, whether Scripture's vision of gender is oppressive or liberating, and whether millions of women choosing tradition over progress means something about what women actually need. The data is clear. The movement is real. And the implications challenge everything modern culture assumes about gender, marriage, and what makes women happy.